Hi everyone, and welcome to this review note. In this clip, we are going to be looking at some basic information about NTFS permissions. I have three machines set up we're going to be working with. One's a domain controller, one's a member server acting as a file server, and the other one is going to be a client. All of them are running Server 2012. Starting off on my domain controller, you can see that we have three users here to work with. We also have three security groups. The John Jones user account is a member of Group 1, and the Jane Doe user account is a member of Group 2. If I switch over onto my member server, I've got three folders that are shared out, Data 1, Data 2, and Data 3. In each of these cases, if we look at the shares, here we can see the three shares that are set up. And if I look at each one of these, we can see that from a share permissions perspective, everyone has full control as per standard best practices. That's for Data 1. I'll do the same thing for Data 2. We can see again, everyone full control. And then for Data 3, again, everyone full control. Start off with, we're going to look at what permissions are set up by default. If I open the properties of Data 1 and select the Security tab, we can see the standard access control list. There are 5 different access control entries that we can see from here. Creator owner has special permissions. System has full control. My user account has special permissions. I'm the owner. We'll see this in a minute. We have administrators group, which is local to the member server, which also has full control, and then the users group, which has read and execute, and then special permissions down here at the bottom, and we'll look at those in a minute. If we need more detail, we can click on Advanced. That will bring up a dialog that is going to have a number of different tabs. The first one, we can see the access control entries that are part of the ACL with a little bit more detail to them. And we can see whether it's allow or deny. We can see the security principal, the level of access, and then the scope of the permission. One of the things you'll notice is that these match up with what we saw previously in the standard view out here. Except that in this case, we actually have two different access control entries for the same security principal, users. And we're going to see the effect of that in just a little bit. Also notice that we can see the inheritance. So these permissions are inherited from the root of the G drive. Now, if I want to look at what any of these permissions are, for example, we can see that users has something called read and execute. I can select any one of these access control entries, and if I hit view, I can see again my security principal. I can see that this is allow. I can see the scope. And I can see the basic permissions that are set up for that. We have 6 basic permissions: full control, modify, read and execute, list folder contents, read, and then write. The one down at the bottom is special. That's the one that will be highlighted if we don't use a standard set of basic permissions. You can notice that we also have multiple of these basic permissions selected. So for example, read and execute happens to include list folder contents and read. So I could select either one of these guys individually, but if I select read and execute when I'm creating the access control list, then that will grab all 3 of these by default. Now, Microsoft also has a number of atomic permissions, or they're labeled here as advanced permissions. And if I select this, we'll see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different atomic permissions that make up this read and execute. And if I have a set of permissions that I need that are not one of the basic ones, then I can pick and choose between these atomic ones however I want. And we hope, one of the things Microsoft hopes is that we can use the basic ones and not have to worry about picking out the individual atomic permissions that we have over here. So that's essentially the view part. Okay. Now, one of the things that very often we want to do is find out what permission a user actually has. So if I look at some user or some group within my organization and I look at the permissions, if they have read and execute, what that will show me is that I've got these permissions. I'm going to close out of here. The way that we do that is with this tab called Effective Access. If I select that, then we'll see that, again, we're working on data 1 on the G drive and I own it, my user account owns it. If I say select a user, and I'll pick the John Jones account. So here's John Jones, and if I want to see what permissions John has, I can select View Effective Access and then scroll down into this window and see that list of atomic permissions that John has. So we can see traverse folder, we can see list folder, read attributes, read extended attributes, and then read permissions, which is part of read and execute. But look at this, we've also got create files and we've got create folders, which is obviously not a read type of a function. That's going to be a write type of a function. And we can look at this and say, hey, wait a minute, where did these permissions come from? Which will bring us back to another point that I made a little bit earlier. Let me go back over to permissions. Notice that users has 2 access control entries. So read and execute is going to take care of, on the effective access for John, those 5 atomic permissions we saw before. This one, this one, this one, this one, and read permissions down here. But if I back up and look for these other 2 that allow me to create, then that has to come from somewhere else. And if I pick this second user's access control entry that says special and view that, you'll notice this is special permissions. It's nothing that's part of the basic. In the advanced permissions, here's that create files and create folders. And what that tells us is that any person or any user who is a member of a group or groups where there are multiple access control entries, we accumulate those permissions. So John effectively has a combination of the 5 atomic permissions that make up read and execute, plus he's got create files and create folders because of the fact that he is a member of the users group, and the users group has 2 different access control entries providing different sets of permissions. Now you might look at this and say, well, why do we have 2 access control entries? Why don't we just do one that's special? And we could absolutely do that, except in this case, the read and execute, the scope, is for this folder, all subfolders, and all files, whereas for this access control entry, the scope is this folder and subfolders. We can always combine whatever combination of those atomic permissions we want into an access control entry. What we can't do, though, is have a combination of different scopes, or as Microsoft labels this applies to. And we'll see where that comes into play a little bit later. Now, let's try this out and see what ends up happening. I'm going to close out of this, and I'm going to go over to my client VM, and I'm going to log on as John Jones. According to the permissions, I should be able to open a folder and navigate to my file server. And here's my data 1. So I can get into that, absolutely no problem. I should be able to create a file in here according to those permissions because I have the ability to create files. So if I say I want to do a new text file, I can do that. So there's my text file. I should be able to create a folder, no problem. So let's try that as well. And we can do that. So here are John's files and folders. Of course, John should be able to make changes to this. And exit out of that and save, and we can do that. Same thing if I open John's folder, I should be able to create something in here as well. Awesome, so that's it for John. Now, what about access that somebody else would have to John's content? Going to log out for John, and I'm going to log in as Jane Doe. So let's open our file browser, and I'm once again going to data 1. Jane can get into that. Jane can see the content that John created. If Jane tries to open John's file, she can see that. If she tries to change it and close this out and say save, it's prompting us to save as, meaning that Jane cannot update that content. So she's got read access to it, but not write. So I'm going to get out of this and I'll close this and say don't save. If she opens John's folder, of course she can see what's inside of that. If she tries to create her own content, say I try to create a file in John's folder, I can do that. So Jane has the ability to create new files in any folders that John creates. She can view anything that John creates, but she cannot modify any files that John creates. Now, what if we wanted to find out that ahead of time without logging on as Jane, right? Because we're not supposed to know as admin people the passwords of our users, but we want to find out everything's going to work well. I'm going to switch over here to my file server again. Oops. And if I go down into data 1, if I open the properties for this file for John, and if I look at security, same as what we saw before, I'm just going to go into advanced, and we can see that users has read and execute. And since Jane is a member of that users group, then she's going to have this permission. If we want to check that out for sure, I can click on effective access. I can say that my user is going to be Jane Doe. Effective access, and we can see those permissions that make up read and execute. And that's all great. If I look on John's folder and bring up the properties and the security and advanced, again, I can see all of these permissions. Again, this is all inherited from G. But something I want you to kind of notice is that when we look at the folder, we've got those two users access control entries, just like we had up on the data 1 folder. Whereas, if we look at the file, then that is not the case because we've only got the users with read and execute. That's something I want to bring up that's really important because we need to know why did this happen. And if we go back to the original folder on data 1 and look at the properties here, we can see that the scope of read and execute is this folder, subfolders, and all files. This permission is going to be inherited by every single folder and every single file that ever gets created. However, if we look at the part that gives us write, the scope is this folder and subfolders only. There's no files mentioned here, meaning that although a person is going to get the ability to write, they'll get the ability to write into this folder and any subfolders. So in other words, if we create a subfolder, that subfolder will inherit the write permissions, but it's not going, but not for files. And by changing the scope, we can change what objects are going to inherit those permissions. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail later on. Next thing we're going to do is look at something a little bit different. What happens if the permissions that are created by default at the root of the G drive are not what we want? I'm going to close out of data 1. We're going to work on data 2 for this. Bring up my properties here, and in security, let's say that I don't want the users to be able to write. Well, one of the things that we can do is counteract this permission by creating a similar permission, but one that is going to deny the access. So we know, for example, if we look at this permission, which is special, and view, that the permissions we're actually getting here are create files and create folders. Let's say we don't want that. We still want the read part, but we don't want the write part. I can come in and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to add a new access control entry. And I'm going to assign this to, I'm going to use the exact same security principle. So instead of finding the security principle in my domain, I'm going to change this to my member server. I'm going to say I want the users group. And the users group by default is going to get read and execute, so I don't want that. And I'm going to go into the advanced permissions, pick the create files and create folders. I'm going to say deny. And I'm also going to change the scope to be this folder and subfolders. So exactly what the allow permission is, but I'm going to do a deny permission instead. And I'll say OK. And we can now see here is the new access control entry, deny users special. This is not inherited, so this is explicitly applied onto the data2 folder, won't affect data1 or data3, this folder and subfolders. Now deny overrides allow, which means that John should not be able to write. Once we have that, we apply it to put it into effect. And let's see what that permission is going to be. We go over here to effective access. We got John Jones. Let's say that we're going to view effective access, so we'll repeat that. And then I'll come down and look, and sure enough, John has all of those atomic permissions that will allow him to read and execute, but no longer can he create files and folders. Awesome. And we could go out onto our client and we could try that out. In fact, let's do that just to make sure. So I'm going to go over to my client, and I'm going to log out as Jane, log back in as John Jones, open our folder, pick data 2, and John should not be able to create anything. If you try to create a folder, access denied. Fair enough. So that's all great. Now let me switch back over onto our member server. If I, as the admin, come along and I try to create a folder, we also come back and see that access is denied. Now, why is that? Back up over here on data 2, bring up our properties and security. Hey, I should have no problem here. I've got full control. I'm the owner of this, except that I'm also a member of the users group. And since deny overrides allow, that means that this access control entry is also preventing me as the owner from being able to modify anything within that folder. And that can be a bit of a problem. So we have ways around that too. So let's take a look at removing inheritance. Now the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this deny, because I don't want that. So that's now gone. These guys, if I wanted to just get rid of this guy because it's someone causing the problems and try to remove it, I can't do that. And the reason I can't is because it's inherited from the root of G. So if I don't want that permission, what I can do is say disable inheritance. I've got two options here. I can either convert all of these permissions to explicit permissions, or I can remove them all and start from scratch. In my case, I only want to get rid of one. So I'm going to say convert inherited to explicit. Notice that inheritance now says none. I'm going to take this guy down here, which is the offending permission, and I'm going to remove that. And once I've done that and I apply, now users can read and execute, but nothing else. Now something I've done you want to be very, very careful with. You should never ever disable inheritance or remove inheritance unless you absolutely have to. So the best practice is this. When you create a folder under the root of the drive, so data 2 is right under the root of the G drive, and there are permissions that you do not want to have. For example, every user on the system who can authenticate in can create content, and every user on the system who can authenticate in can read all that content. Quite often you may not want that. So disable the inheritance here and remove, but from then on in, any subdirectories down inside that folder structure, you should not be removing inheritance on. Okay? And at this point in time, we're finished with that, and it's that easy to set that up. Let's look at how we start accumulating those permissions or building the permissions up. I'm going to get out of here for now. And inside data 2, I'm going to create a folder called folder 1. Nothing special. If I open the properties and look in security, again, we'll go into advanced security, we can see that now we have permissions being inherited from data 2. So again, I created this, I own it, so I have full control, administrators have full control, users have read and execute. What if I want all of the users who are in group 1 to have the ability to read or write in here as well? I'm just going to cancel out of this and go back into the standard view. We always want to add permissions if we can from the standard view, just because it's a lot simpler. Let's take a look at that. If I edit, I can see my permissions, so my access control entries. I can say add. I want group 1, this one, and by default it does read and execute. I'm going to add write into that as well, and I'll say OK, and we can now see our group 1 and the permissions that are explicitly set on this folder, hence the check marks are black instead of gray. If I go to advanced, here is my group 1. This is all excellent. Read, write, and execute. Now, if we recall, John Jones is a member of group 1. So if I look at the effective permissions and I pick John, I should see that John has write added in. So that means he can create folders, he can create files, he can also write attributes and extended attributes. Those 4 atomic permissions are part of that write checkbox that we clicked. Now what about Jane? Jane is not a member of group 1. So therefore, if I change this to Jane Doe and I view her effective permissions, we can see that Jane still has read and execute. So that is a very, very common practice. As we go down into the directory structure, we start building up the permissions that different security principles are supposed to get. And that way we don't end up with applying permissions higher up in the directory structure and then having to take them away down lower. We want to start with the minimum at the top and then build up as we go. Okay, that's pretty cool, right? Let's get out of here for a minute. And I'm going to create a folder 2. And we're going to allow group 2 to have write permission into here. So very similar to what we did before. Say edit, I'm going to add group 2. We'll allow them write. And if I go down into advanced, I can very quickly, with group 2 having read and write and execute, I can check my effective permissions. We would expect John Jones, being a member of group 1, to have read only. So here is read and execute. And we would expect Jane Doe, being a member of group 2, to have those write permissions. And sure enough, she does. Awesome. Now, what about if we don't want even read access between those groups? What if we don't want John to be able to read what's in the group, the folder 2, and we don't want, or John is a member of group 1, to read what's in folder 2, and we don't want the members of group 2 to read what's in folder 1? We know we don't want to use deny. Okay, that caused all kinds of problems from before. Now, one of the things that we can do is we can get rid of that user's read. So let's try doing that. We'll go back up to data 2. So let me get out of here. So in data 2, we can bring up the properties here and go to security and advanced, and we see that this user's read execute, this is the one that's causing the problem right now, because John is getting access to folder 2 because of this, and Jane is getting access to folder 1 because of this, as far as read is concerned. If I pick that and remove it, then that goes away. Isn't that great? Now, let's try to see what the consequences of that are, if anything. If I go back over to my system, my client system, and I'm going to log on as John Jones. That's good enough for testing. So if I pull up my file browser, I'm going to go back. Let me close this out, and I'll come back into this. I try to go back into data 2, I now get an access denied error because I don't have read permission on data 2 anymore either. Okay. What happens if I try to go all the way through to folder 1? Okay. I can't do that either. Okay. So that's kind of a pain. We need to fix this, obviously. I'm going to log out here as John and then go back over to my server. So let's work on this. If I go in here and I add in users, one of the things that I can do at this level is I can say, well, let me put back in, and I'm just going to use domain users in this case, which is going to be the same effect. I can look at this and say read execute. Okay, that's all cool. But instead of doing that with full scope, what if I change that to this folder only? Which means that whoever logs in will be able to get read execute. They're going to be able to see all the content in the folder, but that permission is not going to be inherited anymore. So if I say OK on that, let's take a look down underneath here at folder 1 and look at folder 1. And hey, there's no users or domain users in this case that's been inherited down here. So there's no read permission for domain users on that. So if I go back over now to my John Jones account on the client, pull up my file browser and try to go back to data 2, John can now see this. And he can open folder 1, see whatever content's in there because he's a member of group 1, right? So he can get into data 2 because he's a member of domain users. He can get into folder 1 because he's a member of group 1. So he's accumulating these permissions or acquiring these permissions. Now, if we go back and he tries to get into folder 2, oh yeah, access is denied because John does not have permission on folder 2. He's not a member of group 2. So we're getting pretty close to having something that works really, really nicely for us. The only thing is these permission denied errors that come up. There's a couple things with that. One, it's ugly. Number two, users have a tendency to look at something and going, hey, if that's there and there's permission denied, I think I should probably have access to that. That's the way people are, right? So what if we could do something that we didn't have to worry about users coming along and getting access denied errors? And we can do that as well. Let me log out of John Jones here. I'm going to go back over onto my member server, my file server. And what I'm going to do is get out of here, and I'm going to pull up Server Manager and look at something that's kind of interesting. Let me do a quick refresh here on the shares. And here are my data 1, data 2, data 3 shares. I'm going to look at this guy and bring up my properties. And we have this really cool thing in settings called access-based enumeration. And I'm going to enable this. And what that will do is whenever somebody opens a folder, if there is any content within that folder that they don't have permission to, it's invisible. They don't even see it. Let's check that out. If I go over back to my client, I'm going to log back on as John Jones again. Since I'm logged on as John Jones, I'll bring up my file browser. I'm going to go back to KW Server 2 data. Oops. And now, here's folder 1. Pretty cool. Folder 2, not even there. So John will now not be one of those people who can come in and say, hey, there's something that looks interesting. They try to open it, gets access denied. The next thing you know, he's talking to his boss and going, hey, I should have access to that. Go and talk to those IT guys for me. All right. And that brings us to the end of Intro for NTFS. There are a couple more videos that are going to be set up for this as well, for looking at different common use cases and configuring NTFS permissions. So wrap for the video. Hopefully this has been helpful for you, and we'll see you next time.